The heat on the street seemed to melt even the asphalt. The wheels became too soft, and the road went in strange waves. Jacob sat in the car, squinting in the pleasant chill breeze blowing from the air conditioner. Once, that man couldn't even imagine that he would have such a good, comfortable car, and that his name would be one of the most famous in the city. A smile appeared on Jacob's lips. The man looked at his driver, remembering that at one time he started the same way. He was once a cleaner at a factory, and then he was able to get a job as a driver for the director. Then, this position seemed to Jacob the ultimate dream, and then he suddenly discovered an old diary in his things. There, Jacob wrote down his plans, set goals for himself, and as soon as he achieved one of them, he immediately aspired to another goal. Only he forgot about his old diary, having not taken it out for a long time. And then, when Jacob opened the diary and saw the dreams of a little boy, his plans that he built in his early childhood, he realized that he had never come close to any of his goals. He seemed to have lost faith in himself when he grew up and stopped there. The young man began to work actively, putting aside every cent for his undertaking. When he quit his job and sold his small apartments, his girl left him, saying that she would never build her future with such a loser. Jacob was hurt because the woman he loved with all his heart didn't believe in him, but he still moved on, and now he has achieved all the heights that he has dreamt about before. The girl subsequently tried to return to him, saying that she was wrong, that she loves and misses him, but Jacob didn't believe her. He understood now that she was attracted to his money, and he didn't need such a girl. Jacob tried to push away the memory of his past life. He got to his destination, and when the driver parked, Jacob got out of the car. The sun's rays immediately began to burn his skin. Jacob grimaced a little and pulled out his sunglasses to put them on. He tried to hide more from journalists than from sultry, scorching rays. There must be a lot of journalists today because Jacob was opening another branch of his real estate agency, which gave jobs to many people in the city. He managed to win the hearts of many customers due to his honest work. Of course, he will have to give interviews, but Jacob planned that this would happen a little later because first, he needed to make sure that everything was in order and went strictly according to plan. The man didn't like to deviate from the plan and believed that if he moved a little in the wrong direction, then everything would surely collapse. Jacob smiled as he looked around at the festive balloon arch. He liked the design of the agency's logo in a color style. The man carefully looked at the neon sign above the entrance and entered the building. Employees immediately rushed to their boss and began to tell what they had already done. All employees loved and respected Jacob, held on to their jobs because they couldn't find another such good boss. Jacob was pleased that people appreciated what he gave them and tried to work even harder to achieve their goals. Jacob smiled as he made sure that the buffet and treats for the people who would come to the opening were ready. The man glanced at the baskets of sweets and fruits and imagined how happy the kids would be, because usually many mothers with children came to their opening. They all knew that Jacob would also take care of the children's program to please the kids. The man didn't yet have his own children, but he loved children and often organized various events for them. Soon, music began to play outside. Jacob looked around into the street and saw that the first guests had already begun to gather. Soon, the host came on stage and began the festive program, followed by the female dancers. Jacob went out to watch the mesmerizing Oriental dances, hoping that the journalists would not bother him with their microphones and cameras. Now the man was watching how the female dancers skillfully control their bodies, performing a belly dance. Suddenly, someone pulled the man by the elbow. Jacob heard a hoarse voice and turned around. "Young man, I'm ashamed to beg here. Please give me some money to buy a loaf of bread. And if you don't believe me that I want to buy food, then buy it for me yourself." He looked at the shabbily dressed grandmother standing next to him. A short, thin, gray-haired grandmother is all wrinkled. She reminded him of a heartbroken and unbearable woman from the movies. Jacob replied, "Yes, of course." He took out $100 out of his pockets. On a day like this, he just wanted to believe people and not check whether this grandmother really wanted to buy bread or whether she works for someone. The man handed the old woman a bill, and when she took the money and began to tearfully thank him, Jacob was stunned. His gaze was fixed on the woman's earrings. The tarnished stones brought him back for a moment to the distant past. Suddenly, Jacob asked in an alarmed voice, "Where did you get these earrings?" The woman turned pale sharply and began to look frightened at the young man standing in front of her. She seemed to be afraid of the question. She shook her head. I can't sell them to you. Apparently, she had already been offered to sell these earrings several times since she was so scared of the question. Jacob repeated his question. I'm not asking you to sell them to me. I just asked where you got them from. My late husband gave them to me. He himself made them, because in those days, the decoration was extremely difficult to obtain. These are exclusive and dear to me as a memory. Therefore, I can't sell them, even if I die of hunger. I'm not asking for money for myself. I could go without food for a long time, but my granddaughter is bedridden and suffering. I need to take care of her. She tries and does everything to get back on her feet. All of Jacob's insides instantly went cold. He remembered the most difficult times of his life. He also remembered Mrs. Barrymore, who was now standing before him, begging. Jacob was born into a poor family. Therefore, his childhood was difficult. He remembers very well how his father lost his job, came home drunk, and started yelling at his mother and him. He told them to leave the house, otherwise he would beat them. He said he was not going to provide for them now. The mother took her little son by the hand and went aimlessly, bursting into tears. She knew that her husband would not throw words into the wind because he had beaten her with her son more than once before. After the woman spent the night on a park bench and fed the boy an apple from a tree growing there, she didn't know where to go. She decided to turn to her girlfriend for help to stay with her while her husband calmed down a little. But when she entered her apartment, she was shocked to find her husband in bed with her best friend. Of course, she didn't ask her friend for any help. Drunk people once close to her laughed at her. Then, the woman wept bitterly and accidentally stumbled upon Mrs. Barrymore. She fed a hungry mother and son and sheltered them in her small two-home house. Mrs. Barrymore helped Jacob's mother get a job, and the woman was able to get back on her feet thanks to her. There she met a wonderful man who later became Jacob's stepfather. Communication with Mrs. Barrymore ended when the woman was given an apartment and she moved to live there. And now she stood in front of Jacob and asked him for money for bread, and he knew that he owed her much more. After all, once she didn't allow him to die of starvation. Jacob asked her to make sure he was right. Mrs. Barrymore? He so often looked at the woman's earrings, which had so much attracted his attention at once. She once told how her husband made and gave her this jewelry. It was an early childhood, and now he saw those earrings again. The woman was surprised. Do I know you? Jacob replied. Do you remember how many years ago you took in a woman with a small child? That child was me. Mrs. Barrymore sighed and covered her face with her hands. She shook her head as if she didn't believe it was possible that she would meet after so many years with the same boy who helped her look after her newborn granddaughter, because the poor woman's daughter died during childbirth. Journalists began to surround Jacob, asking him questions, but at that moment, he was absolutely not up to them. He often recalled Mrs. Barrymore and her invaluable help, recalled her words that always supported him and helped him move on. Mrs. Barrymore said, My boy, one day you will achieve great heights. You will become great and famous. And someday, you too will help someone who is in trouble. And now, Jacob has a great chance to repay kindness with kindness. But the woman, imperceptibly for Jacob, disappeared into the crowd when the journalist blocked her. The man tried to find her, but to no avail. Mrs. Barrymore seemed to be gone. Jacob was angry that he was distracted from an important conversation and refused to give an interview, offering to ask questions to the agency staff. Jacob himself left for the main office. He immediately called his mother and told her about this unexpected meeting. Of course she remembered Mrs. Barrymore. Son, you need to find her and help her without fail. If not for her, we could be at the bottom now. If we survived. This is a great miracle, since God himself gave you to meet so that we could thank her for her kindness. Jacob thought the same way, so he started looking for this woman. Mother told him exactly where Mrs. Barrymore was given an apartment. She regretted that she rarely visited her, and in time she stopped visiting the woman altogether, and she had to be near her and support her, because Mrs. Barrymore has become family to them. Jacob thought about all this for several days. His people managed to find information that Mrs. Barrymore sold that apartment, and no one knew anything about where she moved. They tried to find her by name, but their search progressed too slowly. Jacob became obsessed with finding this woman and helping her granddaughter get back on her feet. He remembered this little baby who looked at him with her big eyes and began to cry. Jacob was irritated by children's crying, but it forever remained in his heart a pleasant memory. The man often traveled to his new branch where he expected to meet Mrs. Barrymore, but it was all in vain. Jacob didn't understand why she ran away, but she didn't wait for him and didn't accept his help. Sometimes it seemed to him that it was just a fleeting vision, the fruit of his imagination. But after a couple of weeks, Jacob got a call and said that they managed to find Mrs. Barrymore. She lives in a holiday village not far from where she met Jacob. She lives in poverty in a house with a leaky roof. Jacob put aside all his business and drove to the address that was sent to him in the message. The man was afraid that Mrs. Barrymore will not want to accept his help because she ran away then for a reason. But as soon as he drove up to the courtyard, the woman went out onto the porch and was surprised. She burst into tears when she met Jacob. "Son, I never thought that you would decide to find me and come to me. Forgive me, I have nothing to feed you. I bought flour, yeast, and cereals with your money, so that at least I can make porridge cakes. I also bought medicine for Jane. She became very weak. She tries to get up, but she manages to do it with great difficulty, or rather, she does not succeed at all." "Why did you run away then? I wanted to help you." Mrs. Barrymore honestly admitted with a shrug. "I don't know. I'm used to doing everything by myself. No one has ever offered to help me. Excuse me for disappearing then. I got scared then." Jacob nodded. He did not come here at all to blame the old woman and make her feel guilty. "Mrs. Barrymore, what happened to Jane? Why was she bedridden?" The woman looked at Jacob, her lips pursed, her eyes filling with tears, and her chin began to tremble. The old woman sat down on the porch and put her head in her hands. "I'll tell you, son, but I know that there is no justice in this world, and I can't achieve it because we tried. I'd asked for compensation in the courts and the police, but I didn't achieve anything." Mrs. Barrymore remembered the terrible events that happened in their lives 5 years ago. Jane returned home as usual. She left work an hour early because her grandmother, Mrs. Barrymore, had a birthday. It was a warm September evening, and there were many people on the streets. Jane was followed by a local police officer. He had shown her signs of attention for a long time, but she didn't like him at all. Also, the man was married, and Jane didn't seek to destroy someone else's family. Alex didn't want to listen to her refusals. That day he was drunk, and he began to insistently demand the attention of the girl. He promised her mountains of gold. He told her that she would be like behind a stone wall next to him. But she needed a defender only so that he would protect her from the harassment of the district police officer himself. Alex followed Jane into her porch. She was very frightened, but tried not to show it, but calmly spoke with the man and tried to explain to him why nothing could happen between them. And then he got angry and attacked her. The doors in the apartment were too deaf, and most of the inhabitants were old people with poor hearing. No one heard the young woman's screams as Alex raped her. When Jane broke free of his grip, he stumbled and rolled head over heels down the stairs. "My granddaughter lay in intensive care for several weeks. She was treated for a long time. We tried to put the bastard in jail, but he denied everything. He accused my girl of offering herself to him. Alex remained innocent thanks to his acquaintances, and we didn't receive compensation. We were then ready to accept the money because Jane needed an urgent and expensive surgery on her spine, and then an idea came to my mind." Then, Mrs. Barrymore returned once again from the hospital. She didn't know where to get money for the surgery, but she couldn't leave her granddaughter lying down. Then she remembered a small dacha that a neighbor offered her for a small price. Mrs. Barrymore phoned a neighbor and arranged to see this cottage. When she entered there, her first thought was to run away from there. Living conditions there were terrible, but the woman remembered her granddaughter and agreed. She sold the apartment, bought a summer house, and invested the remaining funds in Jane's surgery. Doctors said that the surgery was successful, but Jane didn't improve. Then, Mrs. Barrymore went to another doctor, and he said after conducting multiple examinations that the surgery was unsuccessful. But the doctors tried to hide their mistakes. They in turn denied everything and refused to do a second surgery for free. Mrs. Barrymore sighed heavily. and my granddaughter and I stayed in this house, which gets worse every year. Jane began to receive a disability pension, but it's very small. If we had my pension, then we only have enough for medicine and some food, so I have to beg. It's hard for me every time to approach a person with an outstretched hand, but I do it for the sake of my granddaughter. She and I are alone in the whole world, and now Jane is lying, trying to get up, screaming in pain, falling and crying. She cries for a long time from her helplessness and then tries to get up again, but it's harmful for her to do this because her spine is too weak. Jacob silently listened to Mrs. Barrymore's story, but he constantly clenched his hands into fist and wanted to punish all those responsible. He decided that he would definitely achieve justice even after years. Jacob assured her, "Mrs. Barrymore, don't worry. Now you have me, and I will help you. You helped us. Now it's my turn to repay you with kindness for kindness." "Thank you, son. I will be indebted to you for the rest of my life. Although my life will be very short. I've already lived my life, and I'm afraid how Jane will live without me. Don't pay attention to my illnesses, because I only worry about my girl." Jacob entered the house to get to know Jane. The woman for a long time was afraid to look into his eyes, and when she did this, she mentally returned to the distant past. At that time, she looked at him with the same big green eyes, but she was lying in the cradle, and now on the bed being chained to her. Mrs. Barrymore told her granddaughter everything from the very beginning, how she met Jacob and his mother, and how she now met him. The woman was hurt to hear that her grandmother had to beg. Jane wiped away her tears and promised that one day she would get back on her feet and make sure that her beloved grandmother would not need anything anymore. When Jacob returned home, he immediately called his acquaintances and began to arrange for them to take up the case of Jane and the rapist, who still walks free. Jacob hated such people, and he desperately wished that justice would prevail. He called his surgeon friend and found out everything that would need to be done to perform Jane's surgery. The next day, the young woman was taken to the hospital, where they began to prepare her for the surgery. Mrs. Barrymore kept thanking Jacob, crying and saying that she would never have made it without him. Those who did the first surgery incorrectly were punished from the very first day. Jacob's lawyers filed an application to the court, and the head physician of the hospital began an internal investigation to find the guilty and punish them. But the lawyers didn't retreat from their own and demanded a well-deserved punishment for all. Alex was caught in a dark alley, after which he was taught a good lesson by counting all his bones for what he did to the girl. He was intimidated so much that he was forced to flee to the police with a sincere confession, and soon he lost all authority and ended up in a colony, where those whom he had once detained or framed were glad to meet him. Unsweetened life for a man was guaranteed in the next 5 years. Jacob bought Mrs. Barrymore a cozy new house. The woman was crying, and Jacob was actively trying to convince her that this was all her merit, that if it were not for her, he could now be in the colony for theft instead of sitting in the boss's chair and having so much money. The man's mother arrived and helped the woman move to a new home while her granddaughter was in the hospital. Jane's surgery was successful, and for the first time in years, the young woman had normal sensation in her limbs. She tried to follow all the recommendations of the doctor. Jacob bought a wheelchair for Jane so he could get around with it at first, and she was very grateful to the man for such help and support. A year later, Jane began to take confident steps and could do without a wheelchair for a long time. Jacob became a frequent visitor to Mrs. Barrymore, and he developed warm feelings for Jane unnoticed by himself. She charmed the man, and he dared to invite her to start dating. Jane was all for it because she liked Jacob as a person. He had a huge and kind heart. He dreamed of just such a man, and she had been waiting for just such a man for many years.